yodel there, Chris. Yeah.
I didn't do that.
Many cattle tell us.
No, it's definitely not. Yeah, it was. Today we have Dan Snap joining us. He's an employment attorney from Sherman and Howard. He's written and spoken and given both lectures and interviews related to legal marijuana, medical marijuana, legal marijuana, of course, in the workplace. And we're very fortunate to have him. So welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to try and avoid using the microphone, so hopefully those of you in the back can hear me. As Chris said, I'm a partner in the Labor and Employment Department at Sherman and Howard. All that I do is represent employers in employment counseling and litigation. I've been doing this now for 20 years, and before I got into private practice, I was a prosecutor in Denver for 5 years and prosecuted literally thousands of marijuana possession cases. And now, in addition to advising employers on how to respond to harassment and discrimination cases, I also advise employers on how to deal with marijuana in the workplace and what sort of policies you should have in your employee handbooks. So this morning, and I think some of you were probably here last year when I gave the presentation on marijuana in the workplace, Amendment 20, which legalized marijuana for recreational purposes here in Colorado, had just really got on the books. We were still in the process in terms of the state legislature, in terms of figuring out how it was going to be regulated by the state and by local authorities. We really sort of got into that process now, and as we go along in the presentation this morning, we'll talk about where that process is, where we think that's going, and what options you have as an employer to deal with marijuana use by your employees. So as we go along, I'd like this to be an interactive presentation. If you have questions, just raise your hand. We'll answer them, or at least I'll attempt to answer them, and we'll go from there. So a little bit of background. Currently, there are 20 states, including the District of Columbia, that have legalized possession of limited amounts of marijuana for medical purposes. Colorado and the state of Washington have also legalized limited amounts of marijuana for recreational purposes. And Washington and Colorado did it at the same time back in November 2012 by citizen ballot initiatives. Now, in Colorado, Amendment 64 legalized recreational marijuana. Marijuana is, the proponents of Amendment 64, their argument was that marijuana should be as easily obtained as alcohol. So essentially, you should be able to go into a recreational pot shop over here on Colfax or on Broadway, or maybe even over here on Leetsdale, and show your government-issued photo ID showing that you're 21 or over, and you can purchase a small amount of marijuana. Now, under Amendment 20, which legalized medical marijuana in Colorado, you used to have to jump through, or if you still want to get a medical marijuana card, you'd have to jump through quite a few hoops. The first hoop would be you'd have to go to a doctor, and the doctor would have to certify that you suffer from a chronic illness or a debilitating health condition. And if the doctor certified you to do that, and usually the doctor would charge between $500 and $1,000 to make that certification, your name would go on a registry at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and you would subsequently be issued a medical marijuana card. Now, to the medical marijuana card is really important. That is not a prescription. You will have employees come to you constantly and say, oh, well, I've got a prescription. My doctor gave me a prescription for medical marijuana. No, your doctor can't give you a prescription for medical marijuana because that would violate federal law. Doctors cannot prescribe marijuana under federal law. All that they can do under state law here in Colorado is certify that individual may benefit from having marijuana, and that they suffer from either a debilitating illness or some sort of chronic health condition. Now, back to Amendment 64, allows individuals 21 or over to cultivate, use, and possess limited amounts of marijuana without having to be certified as having one of those debilitating or serious illnesses. And that's a big deal, because you don't have to go to a doctor, and you don't have to spend $500 to $1,000, and you don't have to wait to get your medical marijuana card. You can just go into a recreational pot shop right now, if you're 21 or over and you can prove it, you can purchase a limited amount of marijuana. And one of the questions that I get is, well, do you think that the medical marijuana business is still going to exist? And right now, there are still medical marijuana shops that are opening because they have a clientele that's built in from the people who are already using medical marijuana. And so, at least for a while, that sort of situation may still exist here in Colorado. Those shops haven't shut down completely. And frankly, the people who were operating the medical marijuana pot shops, they were first in line to be able to get business licenses from the state of Colorado to sell recreational pot, and that was built into the state legislation. So that if you were already operating a medical marijuana pot shop, you were the first one who was able to get a business license and open up a recreational pot shop. Yeah.
Vance?
Yes.
Can I just comment too that with the way it's being regulated right now, there's still some functional and financial incentive for people to do the medicinal side of it, because there's so much more limitations on the products they can sell retail right now, like the variety of things they can sell, and they're taxing it at a much higher rate. So a lot of the dispensaries are still encouraging people, yeah, you can come in and buy at retail, but go ahead and spend the money and get your card, and then you can buy all this other stuff, and it's for cheaper. And
there could be that incentive, and it depends on how cheaply you can get a doctor to certify that you have some sort of medical condition that qualifies.
Aren't some of these strains being grown specifically for different types of illnesses also?
Yes, I think that there's, in terms of the potency levels, now, for instance, marijuana these days, and when I say these days, in the 2000s, is a lot more potent than what marijuana was back in the 1970s and 1980s, because the technology behind it has increased, and the potency of it, it's just a lot more powerful. And so, and one of the problems that we are currently confronting is there's not a lot of research concerning the effects of marijuana on a person. There just isn't. And so we're in a bit of a catch-up game trying to figure out what level of potency, for instance, is going to have somebody actually be impaired or under the influence that would cause them to not be able to safely perform the essential functions of their job, for instance.
Dan, do you know the difference in cost between medicinal marijuana and recreational marijuana? Is it like this huge difference?
That I don't know.
Have you been shopping lately?
No, I haven't been shopping. It's my job to advise you how to keep marijuana out of your workplace, not how to obtain marijuana. But that's all right. So, marijuana, is it still legal under federal law, or is it? Now, Barbara Walters interviewed President Obama shortly after Colorado and the state of Washington legalized marijuana back in 2012, and Barbara Walters asked the president, Mr. President, what do you think about the legalization of marijuana? And he's like, we've got bigger fish to fry. We actually have big problems besides these two states legalizing marijuana. But nevertheless, the president instructed Eric Holder, the U.S. Attorney General, to do an analysis between the conflict in the states that have legalized marijuana either recreationally or medically or both, and federal law. Because under federal law, possession, cultivation, distribution, use of marijuana is illegal. And federal law is the supreme law of the land under the Constitution. So if it's in conflict with federal law, it cannot be legal in the United States. And it is in conflict with federal law. But the U.S. Department of Justice, which is led by Eric Holder, issued several memos, but the most recent memo that I want to direct your attention to is a memo that went out on August 29, 2013. It was issued to all the U.S. attorneys across the United States. Now, U.S. attorneys are the counterpart to elected district attorneys across the country. And the U.S. attorneys are charged with prosecuting and enforcing federal law, specifically the Federal Controlled Substances Act, which makes marijuana a Schedule I controlled substance legal under federal law. This memo provided additional guidance to the U.S. attorneys in terms of prosecuting these cases. And that guidance was that the U.S. attorneys should focus their prosecutorial efforts on organized crime and drug cartels, and not focus their efforts on the individual users of marijuana in the states that have legalized marijuana use, or the physicians, or the businesses that are selling marijuana in these states. Now, that's not to say that these businesses, if they, what I consider to say, cross the line, where they're not following the guidelines that their respective states have implemented in terms of the grow procedure, the cultivation, the selling, that can still be a violation of federal law. Some of you may be familiar with the 9 News story, I think it was about 2, maybe 3 years ago. There's a gentleman down in Highlands Ranch, and he got on 9 News and was talking about the fact that he was growing all of these pot plants in his basement with his hydroponic lamps. And he was making thousands and thousands of dollars a week. Well, that attracted the attention of the DEA. And they raided his place, and they seized all of his plants, and they arrested him. And he recently pled out, and I think he either got, it was either a 5-year prison sentence or a 5-year probation. I think it was prison for possession with intent to distribute, because he was growing so much marijuana that it just wasn't within the guidelines. And so, even though the U.S. attorneys are taking a hands-off approach, that doesn't mean that they're just going to close a blind eye to things in the states that have legalized marijuana possession and use. They're still going to, if you're going to be bold enough to get on 9 News and brag about your marijuana business, you're probably going to attract some attention from law enforcement. And it's probably not the attention that you're going to want. And those cases are very difficult to fight, especially when you get into federal court. What the Department of Justice said is that they're deferring their right to challenge legalization efforts in the states that have legalized marijuana at this time. Now, does that mean that marijuana has been legalized by the federal government? And the answer is no. Only an act of Congress can legalize marijuana. Now that brings us to a bipartisan congressional support here in Colorado. Yes, actually Democrats and Republicans getting together on a marijuana issue. Representatives Diana DeGette, a Democrat from Denver, and Mike Kaufman, a Republican from here in Aurora, introduced the Respect States and Citizens Rights Act in Congress shortly after Colorado passed Amendment 64. This bill is designed to exempt states from the Federal Controlled Substances Act provision on marijuana. This bill is still pending in Congress. So basically what this bill would do is Colorado, Washington State, the other 20 states in the District of Columbia that have legalized marijuana would be exempt from the Controlled Substances Abuse Act. Do I think that this bill is going to pass Congress? No. Not when there is a carve-out for just a handful of states. Do I think that there could be a bill introduced into Congress to remove marijuana from the Schedule I Controlled Substances Act provision? Yes. And do I think that's going to happen in the next year or two? No. But I could see it happening in the next 3 to 5 years. And especially if the tobacco and pharmaceutical companies believe that there is a lot of money to be made in recreational and medical marijuana, I think that you're going to see a lobbying push and effort on the federal level to legalize marijuana. And before, if you would have asked me when the medical marijuana shops were opening up for the first time back in 2009, and when they really started to spring up, my response would be, I can't see Congress legalizing it in the next 20 years. But my attitude has changed because the proponents of legalizing marijuana, they're very smart, they're very sophisticated, they're well funded, and what they've done is a grassroots campaign going from state to state to state trying to legalize marijuana, and they've been very successful. In fact, there are state legislatures in Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, and Georgia that are thinking about legalizing marijuana in one form or another, mainly for medical marijuana purposes. But when you're looking at those sorts of states, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, those are conservative states.
Oh, yeah.
And they're even considering, I mean, those are very conservative states, and they're considering legalizing marijuana. That tells you something. Because if there's a majority of the states that legalize marijuana, I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on Congress to act at a federal level. I heard anecdotally from some lobbyists who work in Washington, D.C. on a regular basis that the legalization of marijuana, that's just not on Congress's radar right now. But once again, the more states that legalize marijuana, the more pressure that I think you're going to see on Congress.
I think if Obama comes out against it, they'll probably vote it in next year.
The Drug-Free Workplace Act. In 1988, the Drug-Free Workplace Act was passed by Congress, and it applies to any organization that receives a federal contract of at least $100,000 to establish a drug-free workplace. How many, show of hands, how many people in here know whether or not their companies are subject to the Drug-Free Workplace Act? So quite a few folks. Okay, well, that's good. It requires that your organizations that receive federal grants of any size establish and maintain such a policy. But what's important about the Drug-Free Workplace Act is it doesn't require you to drug test your employees. And it doesn't require you to fire your employees if they test positive or even if they're convicted of a drug-related offense. What it requires you to do is to have education programs in your workplace about a drug-free workplace, and also to report convictions of drug offenses. And typically, if somebody's been convicted of a drug offense, my hunch is you're probably going to terminate their employment. So that hopefully won't be an issue for you. But the nice thing is that if you are subject to the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988, you can have a complete zero-tolerance drug policy in your workplace. Absolute, complete zero-tolerance drug policy. And you can say, well, I'm a federal contractor, and the federal government won't allow me to have anything less than a zero-tolerance drug policy. And so if you're going to work here, you cannot be using your marijuana on the weekends and then think that you're not going to get terminated if you test positive for a drug test. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are lots of issues that involve employees who are using marijuana, medical marijuana. They're claiming that they have to use it to treat their disability. And under the amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the recent amendments that is, basically anything that lasts more than when I say anything, any malady or illness that lasts more than 6 months is going to be considered a disability under the ADA now. However, the ADA does not require employers to accommodate the use of marijuana. That's important. So if you have an employee that says, I've got glaucoma, And I smoke marijuana because it helps ameliorate the symptoms of my glaucoma condition.